Today, I'm going to talk about a topic which is very important to me. Having the ability to walk away from a deal, from a situation, from something that you don't like gives you leverage. Imagine you're in a situation where you need money for rent and you've got to start selling stuff that you own so that you can afford rent. If you need that rent in a hurry, you probably can't wait for the best deal. You just have to take what you can get. So many people spend years of their life in situations like that, not just with money, but because they're dependent on some outcome, on some person. And the more dependent that you are on one person, a job, a client, a supplier, an opportunity, an outcome, the less freedom that you have to refuse bad terms. The goal is not really to constantly walk away, but it's to preserve your ability to walk away. So someone who can walk away from a bad situation has more leverage. They're not as dependent. I think that this idea applies to so many different things. The amazing thing about this idea of being dependent is that someone doesn't need to physically force you if they control something that you feel like you can't afford to lose. The more desperate you are, the less leverage you have. Some examples of this: an employee who desperately needs their job. They're living month to month. They can't afford to lose that job. That boss, that job has massive leverage over you. Say you start a business and instead of having 10 customers, you've got one big customer who is 90% of all of your income. You're jumping through hoops for that person. Okay, you can't afford to lose that customer. If you're dependent on a relationship for affection, approval, companionship, you don't feel like you can produce another option. You don't feel like you can find another person. Okay, that person has massive leverage over you. If you want to buy a product and there's only one supplier, that supplier has massive leverage over you. The harder that something is for you to lose, the more influence whoever controls it can potentially have over you. This does not mean that the person on the other side of that is deliberately manipulating you. That leverage can exist just because of the structure. Our tolerance to bad situations, bad deals, bad relationships is like a spectrum. It goes from ideal to acceptable to tolerable. It starts becoming more costly. Then it reaches the edge of your tolerance, and then it's just no longer worth accepting. And the question isn't just, do I dislike this? It's, is this overall situation still worth accepting? Because you can tolerate an imperfect situation. The problem begins when your tolerance becomes effectively unlimited because you don't have an alternative. You can't afford the alternative. You can't produce the alternative. You could have a boundary, but if your boundary is basically unlimited because the other person knows that whatever happens, you will stay, then threatening to leave doesn't mean anything. You have no leverage. Being able to walk away from a bad situation matters because there is a point where accepting the situation becomes worse than losing it. Not being able to walk away creates dependence. Being able to walk away creates independence. Having this ability to be able to walk away from a job, for example, is built before you need it. You generate having optionality by having savings, by having transferable skills, having multiple customers, having information, having knowledge about what alternatives exist, and avoiding having an excessive dependence on one thing. I've been in the situation where I've had to take what I can get. And ever since I had to do that a few times, this has been something which has been a massive part of the way I think, because you always end up with a shit deal when you have to take it. There are good deals, there are bad deals. And a lot of times, if you just have to take a bad deal, you'll find that that's where you end up because you can't afford to wade through all of the shit situations to find a good one. You can't hold out until there's a buyer with a good price. You can't hold out for a good offer for a job. I think the most basic way you can implement this in your life, if you're living month to month, if you've got a single source of income, is just building up reserves, having some more savings. This ability to be able to walk away is not built in the exact moment that you decide that a situation is not good. You need to have the options built before you need them. If you have a job and they just start taking the absolute piss out of you, they start expecting more from you, the whole situation just becomes unbearable, but you don't have any money because you've been living month to month. Now what? You can't walk away. You don't have an alternative. You don't have any savings. You just have to put up with that situation. So you can't really walk away because you can't afford to. And then because you don't have options, you end up in these bad situations long term. The ways that you generate options in the most simple way is having savings. If you don't have savings, building your savings should be something that you're working. If you don't have skills, building your skills is something that you should be working on. If you have one customer or you rely on a small number of customers, you should be working on building up your customer base. And if you're overly dependent on one thing, you should be reducing your dependence on that. And there's an interesting concept here. I was writing this down earlier and I was thinking about someone I know who I feel like they're basically controlled by their girlfriend because they're so dependent on the validation, on the affection that they get from that person. And I was thinking, you're a big, strong guy. This is like a small person. They're controlling you. How? How does this person control you? And it's because they've got something that you need because you don't have an alternative. And it's not like you couldn't generate an alternative because you could. How did you generate this relationship? You put yourself in situations, you worked on it. Okay, you generated the situation which you're in now. Why are you acting like there's not other options? And so even if you have money, you have the capability, the skills, the network to produce an alternative, okay, you're not totally dependent on this. All of that goes out the window if you're not psychologically capable of dealing with short-term temporary loss. Okay, because a lot of times, just because you can walk away from something doesn't mean that it's not uncomfortable to. For example, saying no to a deal might mean that you make no money this week. Saying no might mean that you feel lonely. Saying no might mean that you lose a friend, that you lose a job, that you lose the living situation that you've got. And so being in a strong position is having the ability to absorb a loss, whether it's financially or emotionally. And this is really the deeper point. Someone with no capacity to endure short-term pain or short-term problems is easy to pressure. Being strong in a situation is having the reserves, the alternatives, and the emotional stability that refusing a bad situation remains possible. And you do not find yourself in this situation just by accident. You don't just end up with reserves by accident. You don't just end up with alternatives by accident. You don't end up with skills by accident. These are all things that you need to be building. I think of it like making hay whilst the sun shines. Even if you're in a good situation, doesn't mean that things can't deteriorate. And if you haven't got alternatives because you're completely dependent on one thing, guess what? It can become a very different situation very quickly. And so to think about this practically, I wouldn't think of it like, how do I stop needing anything? Because it's not really possible. But you can definitely say, how could I make things so that if I lose this or if I walk away from this, that it's not catastrophic. It's just painful, because it's going to be painful. It's going to be inconvenient. I think it's important to think about having redundancy in your life. So from an engineer perspective, that means that the inclusion of extra components, which are not strictly necessary to function in, but you have them in case of failure of other components. So you build redundancy. I think for most people, the simplest way to have redundancy is not living month to month with your money, building up your income. And each of these ways that you need to look at where you're at, where it would be good to get to, and then look at what needs to be done to get there. For example, it's very easy to say you shouldn't live month to month. Putting that into practice is more difficult for a number of reasons. But if you want to save money, just being extremely practical about what that means for you, why you're doing it, and how extreme you're willing to be, those are all decisions that you can think about. But at the end of the day, having some savings is better than no savings, especially if you're working a job which you could lose. And so building redundancy is not necessarily going to be the most efficient thing, but it's there for a good reason. It's worth having. It's worth building. It's worth spending time on. So the principle isn't to just always walk away, but it's building your life so that walking away remains possible. Because when you genuinely have alternatives, your tolerance becomes a choice rather than something that is imposed on you because you're dependent. And this applies to all the areas of your life: relationships, jobs, business, negotiations, money, your life decisions. And I think this is something which all of us can implement. This is a spectrum. How willing are you to walk away from a bad situation? The story I always come back to, which is an extreme scenario. 3 guys, they're all addicted to drugs. And one of them says, I've got an idea. I know about this car that we can steal. They went to steal a car. They were driving a stolen car. They knew someone that they could sell it to. So 3 guys, they go to this place. They knew that the car had the key on top of one of the wheels. So they went to go and get it. And whoever owned this car noticed what was happening and chased them. And then they got into a police chase. And bear in mind, they were all on drugs at the time. Anyway, they managed to get away. High-speed chase. Nothing went too wrong for them. But look at the risk that they took. Oh, and by the way, they sold that car and they got £1,000. Not each, £1,000 between them. So they took the risk of whatever was going to happen from getting chased, dangerous chase, police chase, risking going to jail, risking their freedom, risking their life, basically. This guy has been in these crazy situations, and he said this is one of the most mental things that he's ever been involved in. And he got £300 for doing that. And all I had to say about it was, you do realize that £300 is like 2 days' work in a normal minimum wage job, right? Like, you didn't have to do all that. And he knows that, because it's not hard to understand, right? But he did that because he needed money there and then. That was the option. That was what was left out of the options when he was dependent and he had to take it. Same with the other guys. They all took that risk knowing, like, that you can make that money somewhere else. You know that you can just have a normal job and make that money. But that's the kind of shit that people do when they're dependent. Addiction is an extreme case of dependence, which massively affects the way that you think about things and massively affects what risk or what situation you'd put yourself in short term without really caring about the long-term consequences, or without thinking about them logically, or without selecting options based on how good they would be for you, because you need what it's providing in the short term. That's not a situation you want to be in. And so looking at what things you're dependent on and reducing your dependence is going to be something that can improve anyone's life. Because even if you've got money, even if you've got a good relationship, even if you've got good situations, all those things can change. You build leverage by being able to say no and live with the consequences. And it's highly unlikely that you're going to just find yourself in that situation by accident. This is something which you need to audit about yourself and work on it for a long time. It's not something that's going to be done overnight. It's not going to be something that just falls on your lap. But I think it can be the thing which saves your life, because I don't think that desperation knows any bounds. And I'm talking about some kind of lighthearted ones with a couple of extreme cases, but someone's desperation knows no bounds. It can really go anywhere. And something I want to leave you with is that until you've been there, you don't know what you would do because you're thinking about it from the perspective that you have now. You don't know what you're going to do when you get desperate. And it probably shock you. Stuff that you said you'd never do, you find yourself doing. I think that all of the best things in our life are built over the long term. And if you don't give yourself enough space and don't change your situation enough, I think that the best things in our lives are built over the long term. If you're desperate, it changes the way that you behave in the short term without thinking that much about how it affects the long term. And so by constantly being in desperate situations, you're missing out on the best things that you can build in your life. You're missing out on the best aspects that you could have in your life by continually being stuck in a short-term way of thinking. I think this is something which everyone should take seriously because this is something which is part of everyone's life, whether they've consciously thought about it or not. And I think a lot of people would be shocked by how desperate things could get for them with just a few small changes, and they would be finding themselves doing stuff that they said that they wouldn't. This is an essential thing that everyone should think about. And I think that you can just reduce your dependence on stuff bit by bit. Doesn't have to be overnight, doesn't have to be something that gets resolved today. Okay, you're dependent on XYZ. Doesn't have to be resolved today, but it is something that you should think about and it is something that you should work on bit by bit.